Shalom, and thank you for joining us at Welcome, the Conversion to Judaism podcast. I'm Michael Gilboa, and this is our first podcast. We're doing a special one today. Instead of a special guest like we'll normally have, we're going to have all four of our co-hosts. We're going to spend a little time introducing ourselves. So hopefully that sounds like fun to everyone. All right, let's see. Who wants to go first? Juan, you want to go first? You want to introduce yourself?
My name is Juan Mejia. I converted to Judaism almost 2 decades ago. I am originally from Bogota, Colombia, and I was ordained as a rabbi by the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2009. I live in Oklahoma City, where I work in our local Jewish institutions, and I do a fair amount of work in Spanish, just teaching Torah and making it accessible for people in other languages, particularly Spanish.
I'm Noah Ferro. I converted to Judaism in 2006. So that was, if I do the math correctly, 15 years ago. I live in, I was ordained, there we go, by the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I currently live. And I work in a congregation and in various forms of community work and community service for organizations here. And I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
I'm Esther Hugenholtz. I converted to Judaism in 2004, so almost 17 years ago. And I came to the United States to work as a congregational rabbi about 3.5 years ago. And I am now a proud Iowan by choice, mom of 3, and a congregational rabbi to a lovely congregation here out in the Midwest.
And I'm Michael Gilboa. I converted in 2005, so it's getting to be a while now. And I went to the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies in Los Angeles. Since I was ordained, I've been a rabbi in a few places: California, Kansas, Illinois. Most recently, I am working as the founder of The Footpath, an online conversion to Judaism organization and Intro to Judaism class. We work with conversion students around the country, people who are connected to synagogues that usually they don't have enough students to do their own Intro to Judaism program, and so we do it for them. And it's really wonderful work. I'm really happy with the way it's going. And this is an idea that I've had for a while now, and in some ways flows out of that sort of work, is to try to build an online space where people can intersect with the idea of conversion in a way that's approachable, in a way that speaks with some authority. And I figure there's no better authority on the subject than 4 rabbis who all work professionally in the rabbinate. We work with conversion to some degree, and we're on the other side. We've been on both sides of the Beit Din, and so hopefully we know what we're talking about. I think we do. And so if you're listening to this or you're watching this and you're interested in converting, you're thinking about converting, or you know someone who is, hopefully this will give you some sense of what the experience is like, some sense of the fact that it's something that could be for you. If you already converted, or maybe you were born Jewish, or maybe you don't have any interest in converting, you're just interested in this aspect of Judaism, we hope you can learn something. We hope you can learn a lot from our experiences. We're going to try to be real honest with you. We're going to try to give you the straight story. There are plenty of people who are sugarcoating things, and there are plenty of nice stories out there. I'm only speaking for myself here, but personally, I think that part of what we can contribute is to give people a full, multifaceted look at what it is to convert. I think there are, if I could go back in time 20 years and give some advice to me, I'd say There were a lot of things you were worried about that you really shouldn't have been worried about. And at the same time, there were some challenges that you had no idea were going to come up. And so hopefully we can be that. Hopefully we can offer that advice and that perspective. Ultimately, all of our perspectives are our own. The four of us don't see eye to eye on everything, nor should we. And hopefully, that can offer people the different perspectives they need. So we're going to do a little Torah study. We're going to jump into the text of our tradition and really see what they have to say about conversion. But before we do, I'd like to open the conversation to each of you. I'm very curious to know, what does conversion mean to you professionally, and how does that relate to your personal experience? I know that's sort of a broad question, but there are plenty of rabbis out there doing conversion work, plenty of rabbis doing great conversion work who didn't convert themselves. And I'm just wondering if you have some insight to share about your own personal perspective and how your personal journey intersects with your professional role. So Esther, why don't you go first?
Sure. So the metaphor that I often use with conversion students is that I'm the midwife of their Jewish soul. So even though we all acknowledge that the rabbinate sometimes has a gatekeeping function, that's undeniable. We are the arbiters of Jewish status in a legal format. I really don't like emphasizing that point, or making that the point on which I lead when I engage with seekers or conversion students. And I like this midwifery metaphor far better, that the person presents themselves to me with an innate desire to convert to Judaism, and I am there to facilitate that process for safe delivery of their Jewish soul. And that's the kind of relationship I hope to build up with the conversion student. I'm acutely aware as a convert rabbi that I have both my own biases and blessings, that I will relate to converts differently, and I can speak to them differently because I have this experience myself. I also want to be cautious that I don't project too much of my own experience onto them. I think that's a risk for any rabbi who also identifies with quote unquote minority identity within the Jewish community, that, we are not the gold standard of other people's experience. Other people's experience are other people's experience. But I do have a great amount of empathy and experience. And I think conversion candidates are really validated by having a rabbi in front of them who is a convert. It levels the playing field and takes away a number of anxieties that the convert has. And paradoxically, I'm also able to have some of the more difficult conversations with my candidates if they need to be had, because it levels the playing field. It's hard to accuse someone of myself of anti-convert bias. And I mean, anti-convert bias exists in the Jewish community. It's real. We have all encountered it in some degree or not, but it just creates for a very different dynamic. But I don't want to elevate that dynamic to the be all and end all, but I do think that it's yet another puzzle piece that fits into the puzzle of the Jewish people that's really, really crucial, and we should speak openly about it. I mean, I love this work. I'm very mission driven in it, and I use that word quite intentionally. And I try to be there and share my Torah with people. And I think that midwifery metaphor really helps me access people's heart spaces in a way that is helpful, because a lot of people do present themselves with some nervousness sometimes about, I'm speaking to the rabbi, and it's like, okay, it's okay. In full disclosure, I'm one of you. I know what this feels like, but I'm also, at the end of the day, a professional and a rabbi. So it's an interesting dance, I think.
And I think when you mention wouldn't say there is anti-convert bias in all the corners of the Jewish world. A lot of people, particularly within the denominational spectrum, like to say, "Oh well, they are horrible to converts, while we, whoever we is, are doing it right." And I think we're coming from very different places in the Jewish world. We live in Israel and in North America and South America and Europe. We have different experiences, and we know that there is. It pops up in different contexts and in different ways, but also something it's a little lower than bias, but in many ways, in parts of the Jewish world, conversion is peripheral. Even like two of you are pulpit rabbis, and when we get trained to be rabbis, this is not something that gets addressed as much as writing a good sermon or doing a good doing a dignified funeral that's meaningful and comforting to the family. Or like, as life cycle events go, I received, I don't think, sufficient training to understand what's going on, to empathize, and that's important. Like, I knew what conversion looked like because I went through it, but some of my classmates, particularly coming from more robust, quote unquote, more Jewish communities in the East Coast, in California and Chicago, many of them had not had intentional approaches to conversion. It's not part of their sphere of life, and so I think there's also like this fear of talking about conversion, if it's something shameful or peripheral, or and I think efforts as these just shine light on places where the Jewish establishment is not really focusing.
Absolutely. I don't want to, we're not looking to bash people or name names or anything, but I've been fascinated following a colleague of ours on Facebook who has really gone out of his way to say, like, oh, I wasn't trained in how to do this. I wasn't trained thinking this is going to be a big part of my rabbinate. And now I won't say where he is because I would completely give it away. But he says, like, oh, I'm doing all these conversions. It's a big part of my work. And I absolutely love it. And it's like, it's so affirming. It's so, it's he says it's my favorite part of the job is working with the conversion students, because they're so hungry to learn, and their sense of their own Jewish identity really lifts up his own. But he didn't have the slightest idea that that's what pulpit work was going to involve. And you're right, because I think I had one class, by which I mean like one class session. We had a life cycle class, and one day it was the conversion day, and that was the extent of the training about this in rabbinical school. And I mean, like you say, Juan, I certainly knew what it was like because I had sat on the other side. But you've got to imagine a lot of our colleagues who, I mean, we all kind of learn as we go. We're all learning a little bit in our first pulpit, maybe more than a little bit, about what the job actually entails. But yeah, hopefully we can be there as a resource, with other things that we do to help our colleagues, so that they don't have to do as much learning on the job when it comes to dealing with conversion students and conversion issues. Because I agree with our colleague. Like, I'm not trying to bash anyone. Like I say, like, he's right. It is amazing. It is amazing working with conversion students. At the same time, I hear the horror stories. Oh, I called the rabbi 5 times and no one ever called me back, and now I hate Jews and Judaism. I mean, that's that's the extreme version, but it happens. People, I think sometimes our colleagues don't really have an appreciation for what it's like to be on the other end of that phone call, how absolutely terrifying it is to call a rabbi for the first time.
Right, and I also hope that if there are any prospective converts or seekers listening to this podcast, that we can give them a little bit of insight into the dynamics and pressures of the modern rabbinate as well, because our colleague who you kindly referenced, he or she is just an archetype, right? Like, this could be all of our stories in the congregational rabbinate. So I just want to universalize it a little bit, but you're very busy in the congregational rabbinate, and you're constantly fielding pastoral requests for connection, and we don't have a mechanism for processing, for lack of a better word, conversion in a really strategic way, because we don't really get that guidance from the denominations or in a centralized way. And that is not a criticism of the denominations. I think the Jewish people is still catching up to the fact that conversion is a really growing phenomenon, and it's here to stay. And I think it requires a paradigm shift, that this is a worthy part of congregational life, creating structures for, just like we create structures for Birthright Israel or camp life or other aspects of Jewish life. I think part of the problem or the struggle or the reality is that synagogues are very autonomous, which is also a really good thing. We keep our independence. That's really important. I think there's value in that. But it also means that rabbis are often kind of overloaded and processing this alone, especially if you're in a solo pulpit, in a small community like mine, for instance. I'm it.
Right.
Hey, you email the contact form of the synagogue website. It comes to me. I'm a one-woman show when it comes to conversion, right? So I want to give that as encouragement to potential converts and seekers. Like, if the rabbi doesn't pick up the first time rounds or doesn't answer the email 99 out of 100 times, it's just because they're really busy. And try again and contact the administrator or the secretary. Don't turn that inward on yourself with this false narrative, which we really have to debunk very clearly. Oh, the convert needs to be rejected 3 times, and this is what rabbis are doing by not answering their emails. No, we're just overworked.
Absolutely. Noah, I want to make sure you have room to talk about your professional experience and how it might intersect with your personal experience as someone who converted.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. I was starting to wonder. I was wondering if I was really Jewish because I wasn't jumping in. So I will say, in my experience, we have a number of different communities, and it is hard to know when people approach and they want to learn something about Judaism. It is hard to know exactly what it is that they're looking for. We have had people who've approached us with an interest to learn who were actually interested in missionizing to us. We've had people who approached us with an interest to learn who were genuinely simply curious about a neighbor. And then, of course, we've also had people approach who were looking to become part of the Jewish people. I hesitate to throw that one out there because I realize that there's something in between, maybe, which is they're interested in the Jewish religion, but not necessarily interested in the Jewish people, and that's part of my where my professional experience comes in, and my personal experience together is. Esther used the metaphor of the midwife, and I use the metaphor maybe of Immigration and Naturalization Services. That part of I think I have some direct experience.
Yes.
But what I've experienced for myself, it has been that the conversion process is a process. It does not end when you immerse in a mikveh and you stand before your Beit Din. And affirm whatever it is that they're asking you to affirm. There's some different formulations and language we've talked about, but it is an ongoing process. And for me, I wouldn't say my conversion didn't feel complete, didn't feel like it had really taken root until I had spent 3 to 6 months living in Israel. At which point I really started to understand something about my Judaism and my Jewish identity in a very different way. And then even then, it still took another turn when I came back to the States to live in the States again. And so it is, to me, it's like a process of moving from, you're immigrating from one culture to another culture. And there are all sorts of things that go along with that. There are certain things that you realize from the outset you're not taking with you, or you say to yourself you're not taking with you. There are some things that you realize later, you're like, how did this wind up in my duffel bag? Like, it's still in there, it's there. I thought I left this in the other place. And there are some things as well that you think you're not going to give up, that you're going to keep with you, and that ultimately they wind up not being suitable for where you are after you've made the journey. But it's not a perfect metaphor, like I say, because with immigration you move at a certain point and you're done moving, presumably. But it does continue. It does go through for a longer period of time, and I found that with students with whom I've worked, as well as for myself.
No, I think it's an excellent metaphor. I'm joking apart. I mean, U.S. immigration is, an experience. But as I compare these two processes, having converted to Judaism, joined the Jewish people, and now I'm kind of like, I'm a green card holder for the listeners, transitioning into some form of American identity. I often reflect back on my conversion experience and use that as a touchstone for that second transition. Now, I use that metaphor too. I think it's a really apt metaphor because it enlarges the scope of engagement, right? That this is not just a credo or I love the Torah or I love Shabbat, but this is a wholehearted, fully embodied commitment to a people. And I think that because Jewish identity doesn't fit in any of the neat boxes of Western taxonomy of identity, like our Western definitions of identity don't really apply to Judaism. That's actually a really important point to communicate to candidates.
And I think that this is something that we in this podcast, I think, should be addressing towards the future. We're trying to serve, and one important element is for the people who are at the beginning of the process. Like we have people in all stages of the process, but is really understanding what is that you are getting into, how like the complexities of Jewish belonging and all that it conveys. And I think when you're getting it from an experiential perspective and not just from like, well, this is what our tradition ideally thinks will happen, because we know that that is not necessarily what goes on in people's lives or in people's batei din or in people's congregational involvement or their experiences with other Jews or with Israel, whether it is like with Israelis or the Israeli bureaucracy.
Well, you guys were talking about how much training you get, and I didn't get a lot more training than you did either. The one thing we got that was maybe additional, and this is something new, is that they've started to do a seminar, a weekend seminar, I think of 2 days or 3 days, where you go away and you're talking to different people who've been involved in different aspects, people who've got spouses who converted, people who've converted, who have themselves converted, rabbis who've been involved in the process. And that's in addition to the piece that we did in our life cycles class. But I think the one thing that I haven't seen a lot of people do is to recognize, like you said, it's a complexity. And you combine the theoretical, the hypothetical, and I think not just the hypothetical coming from Talmud and coming from the codes and what it says in Shulchan Aruch and what it says in Mishnah Torah, but what our social psychology tells us we're going to be experiencing in this situation. And then on the other hand, the actual experiences of converts. And putting them together, I think what we ultimately come up with is, it can't just be this, well, I don't know what I'm doing, I let the convert take the lead and they do it all. But it also can't just be, well, I know exactly what they need to do, I'm going to tell them everything and they're going to go through the process. There's some hand holding, but both parties are kind of leading each other. It's a very intimate experience in that sense, that we are
Temet nefesh hager, right? And you shall know the soul of the convert, or of the sojourner.
So that's huge.
And just to extend the midwifery metaphor, as the only person here who has given birth, I can claim that. The baby works too, right? When the baby passes through the birth canal, the baby has to work incredibly hard. It's not just a passive experience for the baby, right? So, but yes, it is a very intimate experience. And I also think that that's where its greatest blessings and dangers lie. And I wish we did get a little bit more training pastorally in our seminaries on the fact that the conversion relationship is one of the few relationships in the modern rabbinate where there is an actual tangible power differential. You know, we don't have so much power over our converts. We certainly don't whip them anymore, like the pre-enlightenment rabbis in the shtetls. You know, God forbid. Like we don't operate on a model of power in the modern rabbinate. Thank God, right? This is a wonderful thing. But when it comes to determining Jewish status and someone's readiness for that, there is actually a power element. I'm not saying that power element is necessarily wrong, because you are called to bear your expertise onto that. And for the sake of the candidate themselves, assess whether this is the right call for them to make. But I do want to name it, you know, and I think it's important that we name it in our training and that we name it for the sake of the relationship as well. And I often feel like that unspoken power element gets reimagined slightly incorrectly as I'm the gatekeeper. It's like, no, you have responsibility and power to do this thing beautifully and justly and kindly and thoroughly. But let's move away from the whole gatekeeper notion, but still acknowledging that this is a really sacred relationship, but it's also a relationship with real implications in that sense.
I think the thing about gatekeeping is it's one of those words that's become very loaded because it has certain connotations in certain circles. But you know, I think we do guard certain boundaries for certain reasons, but it's ultimately with everyone's good in mind. No one's trying to deny someone a benefit that's really going to be of benefit to them in a situation that they're going to be able to participate in. But sometimes we have to say, we realize you're not going to be able to. You want to have certain Jewish things, but you don't want to have the Jewish responsibilities. This isn't really for you. And there are times where we have to say that. But I think that's, you know, it doesn't have to be a dirty word to say gatekeeping. That's in that sense.
Right. I want to come back to the metaphor of the immigrant, because I think it's an interesting metaphor. And maybe I'm not the best person to speak about it, since my family's been here since the Mayflower. But we have two actual immigrants on the podcast. I'm thinking, you know, it's an apt metaphor, but it's also a very distinctively American metaphor. We have this self-identity of this nation of immigrants. There are plenty of other countries that have much stricter immigration policies even than the United States. And I know the United States is stricter than most people realize. But, you know, like I know of someone who lived in Japan for a very long time, and he had a very hard time getting Japanese citizenship. And he was only ultimately able to do it by surrendering every other citizenship he had, including his Israeli citizenship. Which the Israelis were very confused by that, because they said, well, you're still a Jew, so you could always just claim the right of return. I mean, it's a very strange thing that we're doing here, but they like gave him a piece of paper that said, okay, you're not Israeli anymore.
Holland has the same requirement.
Does it? Oh, interesting.
The Netherlands, where I'm from, for the podcast listeners, I'm from the Netherlands. The Netherlands does not accept dual nationality for the sake of naturalization. And so my husband and I are confronted with the real choice. Should we choose to naturalize here in America, we would no longer be Dutch.
But Mike, now, like if immigrant is one of these metaphors, and bringing it down to language, which I think is very, very important. That is one of the main words that we have for converts in our tradition, which is the biblical word ger, which means stranger, sojourner. It's the foreigner. It's the person who is not an Israelite who lives among the Israelites. And I've never thought until you brought it up that maybe when we say immigrant, we are framing it in this American context of, well, we want immigrants, right? Like the new Colossus and
Right,
the
right.
whole masses yearning to breathe free. Whether, like, what is the ger? Is the biblical or the rabbinic or the Jewish idea of the sojourner, of the foreigner, of the stranger, is he or she in a path towards integration, which is kind of like the American model? Like, you come here and then eventually very soon you can participate in the Commonwealth and you gain your rights and your duties? Or is it, you're here and you definitely have rights? Certainly the Torah gives sojourners a whole bunch of rights and responsibilities, but you are here like in the freezer, and you're going to be here, and whether you live here or die here or move away, is there a path to full embrace in Judaism?
Right.
And which is what conversion eventually promises.
Yeah, yeah, and not to get into the weeds here, but if you think about the sort of biblical model to set aside, we're going to look at a rabbinic text here in a second, but the biblical model of, you have these people who they come in from the neighboring tribes, and some of them we're okay with, and some of them we're less okay with. Edomites, you're okay; Ammonites and Moabites, maybe not. And there is an interesting metaphor to modern life where, I'm not the best equipped to talk about this, but my understanding is there are communities of immigrants and their descendants in much of Europe that haven't really been welcomed into the full political and social life of the countries that they're now being born into.
I can
And you have
definitely
this,
speak to that. Yes, as you're
so you have this same notion in the Torah where, so a third generation Ammonite, they're not really in yet. They're not really one of us. And one of the things the rabbis do is tear that down. But not to bring it so explicitly to a modern, like, current events example. But I'm thinking about the video that's been going around from Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor of California. And I mean, if anyone can speak to, if anyone's American, he is, because he's a movie star. He was the governor of California. And he had a message for us, his fellow Americans. And I don't want to get into the content really, or the politics of it, but a lot of his message was, I want to speak to my fellow Americans, and I want to bring you an example from my life growing up in Austria. And I think it's an interesting metaphor to bring, to say that the part of being an immigrant is the complete or almost complete equality, where you can do everything that a born citizen can do, but you bring your past. It never goes away,
Yes.
and it comes with you, not as a burden, not as baggage, but as something to share, something to offer perspective, something to bring in for the common good, for the benefit of all of us.
I do think there's something unique about how America, at least on a mythological level, constructs immigration and the narratives around immigration, and also has conversion to Judaism policies that are significantly different from other parts of the Jewish world in the diaspora, or Israel for that matter. I mean, it's one of the reasons I came to America, is because American Judaism has welcomed me as a convert and is now welcoming me as an immigrant. And both those things are true. And I do think they go hand in hand together in terms of like how American Jews construct conversion, because they place it along the measuring stick of immigration. And I think, that's worthwhile exploring in the future. As for me, I found Governor Schwarzenegger, I mean, he's ex-governor, but I guess the title remains, I'm not sure. But I found Arnold Schwarzenegger's piece incredibly moving as an immigrant. Again, not wanting to delve into the content or the politics of it, but I felt a pride in my chest as an immigrant, watching him and thinking, this could be me or my kids. Because I also was an awesome Conan the Barbarian sword. but on a serious note, but I do think, that aspirationalism for full integration is uniquely American, and it will be interesting to see whether that cross-fertilization, to what degree that cross-fertilization between the American experience and the Jewish rabbinic experience in America is a factor in that.
Let's keep the conversation going. I want to move into the text, and it's Bava Metzia 58b. If one is a penitent, another may not say to him, remember your earlier deeds. If one is the child of converts, another may not say to him, remember the deeds of your ancestors. If one is a convert and he came to study Torah, one may not say to him, does the mouth that ate unslaughtered carcasses and torn animals and repugnant creatures and creeping animals come to study the Torah that was stated from the mouth of the Almighty? All right, so we got a lot of things here that we're not supposed to say to people who have converted.
So, and this usually gets, I think, misconstrued by many people. And I think when we started, some people might have been curious of saying, like, why are all these people saying they're converts? Aren't you supposed to not say you're a convert?
Right.
There is this big taboo about being a convert or speaking about being a convert. And some communities get really riled up and get very adamant about this supposed principle in the Torah. But I think what this text, which is and they quote this text, the source for this prohibition of mentioning anybody as a convert or reminding the people are converts is from this. And I think in its three, what do you call this? Bullet points, and its three laws, what it's saying is, don't be nasty to people because of their past. If one is a Baal Tshuva, one is a penitent, like, well, we remember you were a wild one. Like, you haven't changed.
Right.
Like, no, I have changed. And I guess the child of converts, which this always puzzles me, like, whose parents? Like, your parents who converted, or like their parents? Like, are we dissing your great grandparents or your grandparents and not your parents who converted? But in this case, you come to study Torah, and a year ago you were eating bacon. So how can you square this? Is like what the Talmud is saying is don't do this, but it doesn't say that being a convert is something that should be kept secret. And I think part of what we see in our interactions as converts that decide, well, maybe we want to go into the rabbinate, and we have interacted as converts in community settings, this is a big issue. If people decide to out themselves as converts or not, and in what context, and some people don't have the choice in certain communities, particularly Jews of color tend to have a really hard, even those who were born Jewish will get pinned as converts in certain contexts, which is extremely painful in many cases, not
Right.
because being a convert is anything, but because it's denying kind of like their Jewish story.
Or they're forced to tell their story, whether they want to or not. They're not given the sense of ownership, Like personally, I feel like I get to own my conversion story, because I can walk into any synagogue and like, oh, there's Rabbi Gilboa, and maybe he doesn't look entirely Jewish, but it's close enough.
What does that mean?
And it's like, oh, well, yeah, there's that guy. And sometimes I tell the story, sometimes I don't, and that's a privilege that I get that other people don't.
Right. There's this Goldilocks standards in what we call Ashkenormativity, in the Ashkenazi normative cultural Jewish world. And I want to, make that very specific for a purpose where if you don't look a certain way, either because you look a little more Nordic, or you look, or you're a person of color, that you're likely to trigger those questions, right? Of course, when it comes to Jews of color, there's an overlay of systemic racism in American society that makes it all the more difficult, right? I just want to name that off the bat. But for someone like me who's blonde, I remember a few weeks after my conversion, I was sitting in morning minyan, and I was wearing a talit, a kippah, tefillin, a Magen David, a Star of David necklace, holding my siddur, my prayer book, and davening and praying. And this woman comes up to me and she goes, "Mai, you don't look Jewish. And I'm like, lady,
Wearing
look
tefillin
at
looks
me.
pretty Jewish.
So, I think you're right? Like some of us are able to pass, quote unquote, whatever that means in the majority culture of the Jewish culture you happen to be interfacing with at the time. And some of us don't pass, and that's really destabilizing because it doesn't allow you to own your story in the same way. And I think this is what I always tell my conversion students. We don't have any stigma. We should not have any stigma about conversion. That's why I'm as open about it as I am. But it's your story to own. It's your story to own. Just like if someone is out, an out member of the LGBTQ community, I'm lesbian, I have a girlfriend, whatever, it's their story to own. And it's not up to other people to say, like, so what was your coming out like? How did your parents respond?
Right.
That's pretty invasive, right? So, but it also doesn't mean that they should be closeted about it. I think it's all about the ownership of that story. And Juan is right. It does completely get misread as like, oh, we can't talk about converts and the fact that people convert, which leads to internalized anxiety among converts about the patronymic and matronymic that many of them assume after conversion, Ben or Bat or Mi Beit, Avraham Avinu v'Sara Imenu, the son, daughter, or from the house of Abraham, our father, and Sarah, our mother, because it exposes them, and we haven't quite thoughtfully processed what that means in the Jewish community. So maybe this text can help us do that.
But and on that score, I think one of the things that so you're talking about the experience, looking at Arnold Schwarzenegger, right, and talking about his background, and one of the things that struck me is that he's American, and his immigrant background is part of what makes him the American that he is. It's part of his American identity. Just like my pre-Jewish background is part of my identity as a Jew today. And so similarly, we have to recognize that doesn't mean, that's not taking it away from someone else, someone who's a Mayflower family, for example, right? They're not going to be able, we're not going to be able to say, oh, well, that makes you less American. I mean, I think there's a thread, there's sort of a rather pernicious lie that sort of runs around our culture these days that says, well, if gay people are getting married, then it desacralizes the marriage covenant between two straight people. If Arnold Schwarzenegger is suddenly American because of his Austrian background, well, then my Mayflower family is devalued. It's being thrown under the bus. And what we need to be able to say is, but they're both American. They both have something there. And the same is true of people who are coming to us with a non-Jewish background. People are coming to us from a crypto-Jewish background, from, they've discovered some Jewish ancestors and they want to learn more, but they haven't practiced Judaism in their family for some number of generations. And the same thing is true for people who've maintained a link, and they can tell you all their family back to Rashi and back to Rabbi Akiva. I mean, that is also a Jewish story, and they're all Jewish stories. And I think we can own them, and we can celebrate them all on the same page without saying that one is of greater value or lesser value than the others. And I think that's been a problem for us for a long time, that when people say, my being a convert doesn't mean that I'm lesser than you. What some people, I think people who particularly have a bone to pick on this one may hear is, it makes me greater than you. And that's not what anyone's trying to imply. What we want is for everybody to be comfortable in their own skin and comfortable in their own Judaism, and to take an ownership of their own Judaism. And conversion is one way to get people there.
It's honoring the choice. It's honoring the choice, and something that we've spoken with Esther and Mike. It's having that patronymic, having your Hebrew name being Ben Avraham Vesara, is an incredible privilege. Mm-hmm. It's like, so for born Jews who have like that grandfather that really like for them a love of like either Torah or Israel or the Jewish people or like Jewish cooking, like through a grandmother. And that for them is a central locus of Jewish identity that is rich, and it keeps giving because these memories and recipes and conversations will be part of their story. For us, and we all came to Judaism through many paths and different accidents, but owning that and saying this is my path, and for those of us who love learning text and which I think overall converts tend to, because we have to go through classes and because we are approaching from without, tend to be more literate in many aspects than certain Jews in certain communities, for sure. Just saying like, this is how I am modeling my parentage, my pedigree is, this is the story. This is how I am a descendant of Abraham. This is how I'm a descendant of Sarah. This is how the patriarchs inform my life. And all of a sudden having to like pretend, oh no, I grew up secular, like I grew up, because that is also a thing that we don't talk about, is many born Jews that are coming to the doors of the synagogues are not, because they were born Jewish, more literate or more at ease or more comfortable in a community setting.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah, sometimes
People
quite
did
the
not have a
opposite.
Hebrew education. They did not have a bar mitzvah. And for them, entering that gate when they need the spiritual technologies of our people, and they might be terrified. Like a convert is like, this rabbi's going to scream at me. I never had a bar mitzvah. There's this sense of inadequacy. And I want to tell people out there, if you're a convert, trust me, there's many Jews who are coming with the same sense of inadequacy.
Right.
And both of us, the converts and the born Jews, would be better served by owning this story and saying, I'm a beginner. I'm bringing my beginner mind. I'm bringing my back experiences, good and bad, and I'm embarking in this thing together. And let's talk about it and own it. And we can turn this word that, oh, it's a convert, like the whispers right. in the back of the Kiddush room. It can, as converts take a spotlight and a bigger role in our communities. We know this, but maybe a lot of our listeners don't know. It's been said that 1 in 6 American Jews is a convert. 1 in 6. That is a huge chunk of the population that is
affiliated American Jews.
It's greatly underserved, right? Like there's right now there's books about like LGBTQ Jewish parenting and women's Torah commentary and men's Torah commentary. Like all of these demographics within the Jewish people are starting to realize like their own niche needs. And thus far, that has not happened for the converts, because
there's an a la carte opportunity with respect to the converts.
Right, because there's the myth that once you go to the mikvah, then you're just like everybody else, and we can't talk about it.
Right,
and that is nerfing the Jewish people. We want these Jewish stories to enrich. Like I my favorite story is I was just invited before COVID. It was like January. I was invited for the wedding of a beautiful family that I helped convert in Houston. They're a Mexican-American family. My material is a little bit more accessible. And they had their wedding. They had their chuppah. And we had this Latino Shabbat. And we had tamales and we had wonderful food. And they brought me in to speak about like the Spanish Jewish experience. And for a lot of the born Jews in the audience, it was incredibly liberating. Like, we're going to sit and we're going to eat this amazing Mexican food. It's going to be kosher.
That was something you said that reminded me, though, too, because I was thinking about one thing that's happened for me. So, full disclosure, my wife and I are both converts to Judaism. We're both from the American South. I grew up with immigrant Southerner parents, my dad was from the East Coast, and Italian, very Italian. But my mom's family had been there for more time. And so we both had recipes that we wanted to be able to continue in our family. We wanted to be able to find ways to use these things in our family. But our observance of kashrut, of Jewish dietary law, made that a little fraught sometimes. So it's been, our kind of ongoing project to like find ways to do some of these very, treif ba'ikar kind of, inherently not Jewish, not kosher foods, and finding ways to find alternatives, kosher alternatives to these things, and be able to keep alive some of the traditions and some of those classic recipes and way
Absolutely.
to, we're Judaizing them. We're
Right.
dunking the ham roast in a mikveh. Not really, but you see what I'm saying.
To bring it back to the text, a close reading of the text. There's something really beautiful happening in this text where we say, don't do this. And what's the this that you might do? You might imagine that because God created Torah with the mouth. And obviously this is a metaphor. God doesn't have a mouth, but there's something generative about speech. There's something generative about speaking things into the world. And this is how God creates the world, including the Torah. And so you might say, okay, so out of God's holy and pure mouth comes the Torah, comes the universe. And so only a holy and pure mouth can speak words of Torah. Only a holy and pure mouth that's never touched bacon can generate this Torah. And so, we're saying that this is not the case. This is what the Talmud is saying. Actually, no. The quote unquote bacon mouth has a role to play in speaking Torah. That there is something worth saying from the experience either of the Baal Tshuva, of the person who returns to observance, or of the convert. That it's not worthwhile to silence them either explicitly by saying you don't get to talk because you used to eat treif, you used to eat non-kosher food, or to silence them implicitly by saying it's really important for us that you only speak to experiences that we all share, and that you not speak about your you not bring any wisdom or any perspective from your earlier life. And I feel like this text is rejecting both of those and saying there is something holy, there is something precious, there is something incredibly worthwhile about the fact that everyone comes from their own experience, and we all get to have that generative Torah act. We all get to have that speech. It is in many ways an imitation of God's creation of the world and God's creation of Torah, that we speak words of Torah, and everyone is invited to that experience.
At the metaphor of choice that the text uses, right? Like food, really, like it's so Jewish to me. Like this is the thing we're kibitzing about, like treif. Like you could have very easily chosen the metaphor of the mouth that used to praise polytheistic gods, the mouth that used to engage in idol worship, right? Like, and yet we are fixating not on an act that was spiritual of a previous life that the convert has left behind, but on food, which I also think says something about communal psychology and thick culture in interesting ways, that this has become the defining feature in many ways of Jewish identity, at least in this instance in the text. So I just wanted to point that out.
I think it's about a defiled vessel. I think that's the thinking. I could be wrong, but that what they're trying to say is, oh, well, you load someone up with impure substances and they become an impure vessel, and now they're impure. And so you're going to throw Torah into an impure vessel. Well, that's a worthless endeavor. And what I do think that the text is saying is, Lavdavka, like you can tell somebody, you can give somebody something holy to work with, even if they themselves are not, in the level of holiness or purity that you're demanding, and it can raise them up. It can bring them more holiness. They can find more holiness on their own. They themselves can get to a place where they're purer vessels. We believe in the possibility of repentance. We believe in the possibility of change.
And it's a very bold theological statement, like that the relationship between humans and God is not static, and it goes against the grain, because everyone everyone likes to think it's a very comforting thought that things remain the same. Stasis is very reassuring. And in conversion, like a Yid bleibt a Yid, a Goy bleibt a Goy. A Jew remains a Jew, and a non-Jew remains a non-Jew. And we hear this, I think, less and less. I think it's a blessing. I heard it a lot when I converted, and I'm hearing it less. I hope this is progress, but it's a radical idea that God loves change. God embraces change. God wants the Baal Tshuva to be better.
God is change. Oh.
Right.
Ooh.
And going to what Esther and Noah, like I'm so inspired because in the sense, like, and I went through this myself of like, I have these, like, I don't like latkes. I confess, I latkes, it's potato, it's soggy. I don't like the onion, and like you put sour cream on it. Like sour cream is better than applesauce. I hate latkes. And
soggy? What do you mean?
And I was looking
soggy?
for my latkes are soggy. Maybe I'm doing them wrong. And then I was looking, and then I felt like incredibly guilty because there was these Colombian Christmas dishes that were available that like I had very good, and they were fried and had this very positive, and like, can I just yoink this from my past and now say like I'm elevating it? And in the beginning I felt very timid, and I was like, but now I embrace it fully. Why? Because that's how Judaism grows. Like,
where do you
when
think
Jews when Jews arrived in Poland, they were not eating gefilte fish and foods that today we see as quintessentially Jewish were innovations, either because people got Middle Eastern people, Mediterranean people got to like Central Europe and went like, where are the olive wine? Like, what do? We have to adapt to what's here. And then 100, I'm not saying like 500 years later, like a generation later, this is Jewish food, right? And the same, like, there's this wonderful book, Cucina Ebraica, and you read it like,
I've got that one on my bookshelf.
Like Cucina Ebraica, like the Jews of Italy were saying like, our neighbors eat really well. We should eat really well among the same veins, preserving a sense of, you have fried things on Hanukkah, and you have like whatever.
Dairy on Shavuot.
Right. You have all of those things, but you're adapting. So what we're doing as converts, and like what our listeners might be maybe a little timid in doing, is what pushes Judaism forward.
It's a moving target. It's a constant process of cultural synthesis. It's not a matter of divesting yourself of the old stuff and saying, well, I'm not that anymore. I'm only this thing that you're telling me I have to be.
Yeah, I think it especially comes up around Hanukkah and Christmas in our part of the world, because Christmas is such a big cultural touchstone for non-Jews of Christian descent. So I think especially around that time of year it comes up, but in general it totally applies, right? And it seems so obvious, but I don't think it's obvious. And you're quite right to point it out, Juan, to kind of give people permission to bring their whole selves into this conversionary experience, and that they're transforming something, but not leaving it behind.
Absolutely.
I do really want some recipes for, like, I don't know if you guys, do you do pupusas or yeah?
Oh yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm thinking like pupusas, tostones, maybe some empanadas.
We have a tradition in my synagogue in Oklahoma City. Pupusas are for Simchat Torah.
Oh, okay.
Why?
Right.
Because like 3 years ago, it's like, I want to do something fun. I want to say like, I want to have, like, we have a Simchat Torah meal, and there was this Salvadorian family in the congregation, like, we want to make pupusas. Like, let's make pupusas. Let's make kosher pupusas. Pupusas in El Salvador usually have pork and mixtures of meat and dairy. So like, let's go make cheese pupusas. And it was a huge hit. And then we did it the second year, and now third time's the charm. So now it's a tradition. Our community.
I'll give you a rationale. It's like the Torah, right? Everything is in it. So it's stuffed. There's something inside it. That's a good reason to have a filled treats on Simchat Torah.
There you go. And
that's lovely.
Cannoli in my family.
This seems like as good a place as any to wrap it up. Juan, Noah, Esther.
Wrap it up.
Oh, all right. We're still figuring out this podcast thing, but I want to thank everyone for listening and watching. And they always say like and subscribe and do all of that, so I'm saying that too. And we will see you all next week or next time. All right, take care and welcome.
Shalom Aleichem Malachei Yasharei Malachei